meets the shore, so the ocean 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 meets the shore. You meets the shore, so the ocean meets the shore. The sun meets the shore, so the ocean of all my past meets the shore, so the ocean meets the shore. It was the shore, your eyes that bled me dry. Come give me your I won't beg anymore. Sorry for the stars, but you always have the end in mind. You always had 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 the end in mind.
My name is Minh Bui Jones, editor of the New Comic Review, which David has a copy, the latest copy, just arrived late yesterday, so hot off the press, down at the Reeducation dead table. And I'm joined by David Brophy, who is got a brochure right here, senior lecturer on modern Chinese history at the University of Sydney. Although he's probably better known as an historian of Uyghur nationalism and the author of Uyghur Nation, and also his latest book, which I have an corrected proof copy of, which I think has gone to press recently, is that right?
Yeah, printed yesterday, so it'll be out in a couple of weeks.
Brilliant. And also, he is, according to the blurb from his publisher, a frequent commentator on the Xinjiang crisis, although after this book you might be commenting on Australia-China relations. So.
I do a little bit of that in the book.
Okay, right, let's start. All right, we're going to trace we can start the conversation on China and how we talk about China today by outlining the relationship between Australia, our relationship with Asia, and because I think China fits into that grand narrative of Asia, and it's more in more recent times because of our economic relationship with China that it has become separated from that bigger narrative. And so I like to start this conversation by asking David on his first encounter with Asia. Can you recall? What was Asia? What did Asia look like for you growing up in Gen 2 Adelaide?
Yeah, I wasn't expecting that question. I suppose my encounter was, the occasional Asian-looking face in primary school. And my dad would occasionally go back and forth between China and Australia a little bit. And he, this was a time when China was still quite, remote and felt very closed place. Still, very much thought of as a sort of economic basket case. And we knew of students, this was in the 1980s, who were kind of coming down to Australia to study with my dad, who was at the medical school in Adelaide, and just sort of absconding and trying to make a life for themselves here in Australia. And that was the kind of the place that China felt like, a place that sort of produces these sorts of refugees. And but it was a kind of relationship with those sorts of people that I suppose gave me some notion of China to begin with. I also went to a school that was unusual in that it did actually teach Chinese at high school level, so I had a little bit of exposure to the language before going on to university. And well, here I am continuing.
And then later on, of course, after you've done your PhD and so on, you went on to work at the Australian Centre on China and the World, which then PM Kevin Rudd more or less funded and endorsed.
I think it was an endowment from Kevin Rudd, and it came off the back of 2009, which was sort of the last, we talk about now as the low point in Australia-China relations, but 2009 was also considered a real low point. This was the year of the Melbourne Film Festival, pressure being put on the Melbourne Film Festival to prevent screening of films about the Uyghur activist Reeducation. There was the Rio Tinto case in China. There was a lot of talk that is very reminiscent of the issues people discuss today in terms of the Chinalco, the mining company's bid for a stake in Rio Tinto being pushed back on national security grounds and so on. So Kevin Rudd had a rough ride in 2009, and one of the things he did, reflecting on that, was to say that I need to boost the study of China at Australia's universities. So he gave this money to ANU to establish this centre, which was obviously quite a controversial thing because it then does have this partisan association with Kevin Rudd, but it's still there. And that was the place that gave me my first job after I came back to Australia. So I was there for a couple of years, and then I came to Sydney in 2013 to start teaching history in Sydney.
And of course, we will come back. There's going to be a pattern here you discover in our relationship with China, and that today, of course, when you hear of Kevin Rudd, he's often telling us that we should be careful, that China is on the rise, that we should be ready to push China back. But back then, this is the nature of the relationship, isn't it? It's been up and down, to and fro, and...
Well, 2009, there was still a certain sense in which these different China-related issues could all be kept at arm's length from each other, right? So you could be critical on certain issues, but it didn't get wrapped up into this all-encompassing narrative that we have today, that all of these different things are all related and part of this. That was really what motivated this shift to confrontation under Malcolm Turnbull. No, the strategy under Rudd was to keep these things, to keep things under wraps to a certain extent, because there was still a lot of optimism at that time, of course, that the status quo, essentially, profiting extensively from economic ties to China, while safely ensconced within the protective shield of American military muscle in Asia, that there was confidence that could last at that time. Of course, then we went on to sign the free trade agreement with China and so on in 2014. So in fact, I think there was hope being held out for that sort of, from the Australian elite's point of view, the best of all possible worlds, that we just sell a lot of stuff to China through a wall of American steel, and I think that it's the lack of confidence now that kind of a relationship can persist that has driven us to, what I call in the book, a China panic.
And we come to the last stage, the current stage of your career, is that you're at the University of Sydney at the moment. And you arrived at the university, as you mentioned in your book, when China, our relationship with China had blossomed because of that economic growth between the two countries, the relationship between the two countries. We were, exporting everything from wine to iron ore, and then of course there were the students and then the tourists, and also of course property, and that was at almost the height of that intense relationship between the two countries, economically speaking.
Yeah, I suppose you could say that. I mean, I felt that Sydney University was coming to things a little bit on the late side, but there was certainly, an enthusiasm for China around about that time with Michael Spence, the Vice Chancellor, who was, very much a Sinophile, and putting money into hiring, positions that to do with China. And I mean, that's how I got my job. There was all sorts of strategies being devised at that time to build on this relationship. And Sydney was really trying to advertise itself as a world-leading centre for the study of China and so on. And I think that there was a little bit of, I think we were talking ourselves up a little bit too much. I've noticed, Sydney is still very supportive of the work I do, and but the climate on campus has really significantly shifted in the last few years. And I started to notice it a couple of years ago when the Vice Chancellor, instead of just giving speeches about the wonderful opportunities with China, would start throwing around words like risks. We need to be conscious of the risks as well. And I was curious, what exactly are these risks? But it was a sign of the times, and we know that universities are being under pressure to comply now with this new environment of scrutiny towards foreign interference and so on. So this new paradigm is having an effect on campus.
When did that happen? Can you pinpoint, or more generally, can you pinpoint a time, an event, or something when the relationship or the tone of the relationship shifted?
Look, if you had to pinpoint one single event, then I think there is a pretty good candidate for that. There was a speech in 2017, late 2017, when Malcolm Turnbull got up and he cribbed a line attributed to Mao Zedong, but probably not something that Mao ever said. Mao is said to have said that the Chinese people have stood up, right? And Turnbull said the same thing in Chinese, that the Australian people have stood up. And this was in response to really only a handful of stories that were starting to filter into the media. Of course, in 2017 you had the Dastyari scandal. There were a couple of other similar issues like that, but we know there was a lot of discussion going on behind the scenes, reports being prepared about supposed Chinese subversion of Australian politics and so on, and this was something that persuaded Malcolm Turnbull that a shift needed to take place. So we can sort of talk about how the shift occurred at that political level. Of course, the deeper question is is exactly what is driving that, political shift. But from late 2017 onwards, that's when I really started to notice a lot of issues, the debate just becoming more and more heated and fraught.
So what was Turnbull drawing from? What was it? Was there something? Was there a document, a policy paper?
Yeah, look, I don't have any inside information into any of this kind of thing. The book is entirely based on material that's in the public domain, but we do know that there was an inquiry conducted in 2017 involving various security agencies. There were a few things that came out in a Four Corners episode in the middle of 2017. For example, that ASIO had been briefing political parties, warning them that there were some wealthy donors out there who had links to the Chinese Communist Party, and they should, keep a distance from them. They probably had in mind one of the donors who got caught up in the Dastyari scandal, the case of Huang Xiangmo, a wealthy Chinese businessman who was subsequently effectively exiled from the country. He had his visa ripped up. But there was very little in the public domain, I have to say, and this is one of the things that I'm critical of in the book, the evidence to justify such a really dramatic claims that were being made by Turnbull, but also by the security agencies, that foreign interference was occurring at an unprecedented level, that foreign interference was constituting a threat to our way of life. This was the type of language that was beginning to be used at this point in time, and I was, no one's naive in this discussion. We know that foreign countries spy, and they have various methods to, exert influence in undue ways. But I certainly was not persuaded that there was enough going on, or we had seen enough to really justify this dramatic reorientation of the discourse around China.
Yeah. And was this reorientation, did it seem to you that it was coordinated at all levels of government? From the various agencies?
I think it was very top-down. I think it was very top-down, and there are people who've written about how this all came about, and they say very clearly that this was a process that was catalyzed by agencies like ASIO feeding information to journalists who then relayed this information to the public, and this was this is from people who see this as a very salutary process, that this was a necessary awakening, and so on. But it is quite clear that there was there were decisions made that an intervention had to take place to really shift, because we have to remember that over this period of engagement with China, there's just been a lot of networks built up linking China to Australia that will act as ballast in this relationship, and will serve to sort of maintain a kind of a modus vivendi, even if the political climate is shifting. So to actually really reorient Australian public life and politics, it requires a campaign to start to sort of weaken and undermine those ties. And I think that that's a lot of what this rhetoric about foreign interference has been doing, to stigmatizing types of relations with China that up until very recently were thought to be healthy and beneficial to Australia.
So who were some of the principal characters or institutions behind this coordinated change or reorientation?
I've already mentioned the security agencies. I don't.
I'm thinking of some of the writers and
you've got. Obviously you've got. Essentially what I think has happened is that foreign policy debates are often bottled up in elite circles, right? And it's actually quite rare that a foreign policy debate will break out into public life in the way that this has done, and that's why it's very messy and quite rough and tumble, because you have these elite factions who have a lot at stake in this question, And essentially we can simplify this and say that we've got the security wing of the debate, and we've got the economic wing of the debate, and they all have representatives and all have think tanks that they prefer to support and so on. But certainly the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASIC, has been, they've really been at the forefront in terms of advertising this new discourse of a threat from China.
For those who don't know, ASIC is funded by the Department of Defense, isn't it?
Among other sources of funding. It was originally set up as a public-facing Department of Defense think tank to be a kind of forum for debate around defense, foreign relations, that kind of thing. It's taken on a very sort of partisan campaigning identity under Peter Jennings, who's the leader at the moment, who was he was Howard's intelligence advisor during the lead up to the Iraq War. They've also been quite successful in courting funding from foreign governments like the United States and weapons companies as well. I don't think that necessarily invalidates everything that they say about foreign policy issues, but I do have to say that people taking money from weapons companies should anything that they say about potential conflict situations in Asia should be should be kept in mind.
Lovely understatement there. Sorry?
Can we hear about the Uyghurs and Taiwan, which is more speculative?
Sure.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Yeah. Just be patient. And I just want to, the point is I like to develop it a bit so for people who are not really into following that they get something of a background. Can I ask you therefore, just to follow up on that, what do you think are the motivations of some of the people like ASIC pushing this China pushback or this China panic?
Okay, so I don't like to dwell too much on organisations or individuals and their motivations, but if we could sort of step back a bit and consider the posture that the defence sector seems to have adopted in this current situation, I think it's really motivated by some really fundamental features of Australian foreign policy, which is to say that ever since colonisation, Australia has always existed in this region with a powerful patron, never far away, that is capable of sort of calling the shots in Asia, creating an environment that's receptive to Australian economic activity that can sort of help Australia in its own immediate sphere of influence, what we call our backyard in the Pacific, dominate that region. Of course, that was Britain for a long time, has been the United States ever since. The prospect that there may be a balance of power shift taking place, and America gradually either being pushed out or deciding to downgrade its commitments to Asia, that's actually going to put Australia in a position that it's never really been historically. And this is quite terrifying for a wing of the foreign policy establishment who really, believe that some kind of powerful security shield in the form of the United States is necessary, and therefore, if there is an indication that that is reaching its use-by date, Australia needs to step up and do more to preserve it, i.e. to show to America that we are willing to engage in confrontation, we are willing to, they call it burden sharing, we're willing to share the burden of what it's going to take to maintain your position here in Asia. And so I think that's actually what is driving a lot of the sort of the loud hawkishness in Australia, because, obviously Australia's actions are never going to be decisive in a situation like this. Australia can't, pick a fight with China by itself. So when Australia makes noise around these kinds of issues, I think we have to understand that a lot of it often is really being directed towards America as a kind of a lobbying strategy towards America to send a signal that we really want you to, stay in the game and we're willing to help you do that.
As we did during the Vietnam War too, when America wanted to withdraw, Fraser wanted them to stay and wrote many letters begging them to stay and persist with the war.
Australia was extremely aggressive in the lead up to Vietnam, and it was a similar principle that the idea that by drawing the Americans into the conflict in Vietnam, we would lodge their presence in Asia where we wanted them to be. And that would be beneficial in terms of Australia's vision of, the kind of the post-colonial ordering of the region.
Well, now that we've got the background there on the last 20 years or so of our relationship with China, let's get into the specifics of the subtitle of this conversation. How do we talk about China without falling for this paranoia, without being adopting all the anti-Chinese racism that is quite apparent out there, and to voice our concerns about what's happening in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong or in Tibet without having to buy into the that you're either pro-China or pro-American hegemony. So let's start with the question of the Uyghur and where your expertise. What is happening there?
Yeah, well, I think that we are. You're quite right that we. I think a lot of people are asking the question of how to talk about this situation in a context in which a geopolitical rivalry is escalating, and people are being pulled in different directions on this. You definitely do see people who feel that because of that geopolitical rivalry, then the best thing to do is sort of to go quiet on this issue or to downplay the seriousness of the situation there. You also have people on the other side who think that, you know, because of the importance of standing up for human rights in China, the priority right now is not to not to campaign against war and the threat of conflict in East Asia, or even sort of get behind American-led military and economic strategies against China. And I mean, I think both of those positions are wrong. I mean, I think that China is a situation where we really very often need to kind of keep two thoughts in our heads at the same time, right? So on the one hand, I don't think we should tolerate for a second the idea that there's not a serious situation of ethnic and religious repression taking place in Xinjiang right now. At the same time, of course, when that issue enters into international politics, it does get very messy. But we need to clarify, in any kind of situation, you need to clarify what you think is actually taking place first, and then on that basis, move to engaging with the wider political issues that arise around it. You know, I mean, I could talk more about what's actually going on, but
yes, please do. But also keep in mind how do you separate what is some propaganda coming from certain interested parties and from what's actually happening that we are aware of or know of?
Sure, and look, I recognise that for a lot of people coming to a discussion like this, it can be difficult to, you know, sort what we can confidently know about from what is, you know, what is unreliable. I mean, even for people like me, I've been studying this region for 20 years, and you know, there are certain things that I'm confident in saying, certain things that I'm not. A debate about what exactly is going on, because a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the, you know, the Reeducation campaign, the labour program through which people are being moved around the country or around Xinjiang, these kinds of things. I mean, this is all documented in Chinese government documents, and there's quite a lot of information online. Often the debate comes down to questions of how exactly to characterise this, you know, what sort of language to use to talk about this. And that sort of debate about language then kind of comes back and informs the way people look at this evidence and so on, because if people feel that, you know, people are, you know...
It's what happened in genocide?
Well, this is this is kind of a key question at the moment. I'm not sure if you've come across this, but, you know, parliaments have been debating this internationally, and it's a really difficult question for someone like me to answer. I will answer that, but I just, as by way of preface, you know, it's become one of the key demands for the Uyghur activists outside China that, you know, governments recognise this as genocide, and it's quite understandable why you would ask for something like that, right? Because, you know, you want to maximise the attention on your issue. This is the crime of crimes. If we can, you know, if we can label it genocide, then there'll be some movement on this. Now, I'm not necessarily convinced of that strategy, but the fact is there's no consensus on this issue among the experts. You know, so you've had situations, for example, in America, where the State Department looked at it and the lawyers said, no, we don't think there's enough evidence. And then Mike Pompeo went ahead and said, yes, it is genocide. Now, in a situation like that, it's hard to avoid the impression that the term is being politicised. I referred to the Human Rights Watch report, came out a week ago. They also say that they don't think there's enough evidence to call it genocide. And that's where I'm coming down on the question at the moment. I mean, I don't... Again, something doesn't have to be the crime of crimes, though, for it to be a serious situation of repression. And I've been a little bit disappointed in the way that this question of terminology has kind of come to the centre of the debate, because it's actually having a little bit of it's having the effect where, you know, obviously it's, you know, when you have a term like that in the air, it's very hard for people to sort of raise questions or express, you know, any any doubts about this type of thing, because no one wants to be a genocide denier, right? And it's a little bit of that kind of situation at the moment, and I think the discussion needs to move on from it.
Tell me whether you've, in your research and in your conversations with friends and colleagues, what do you know about what's actually taking place in China?
Yeah, so, I have various sort of, I know people who've had family members dragged out of their apartments in the middle of the night and taken away to these re-education camps for a couple of years. The high point of that re-education campaign has probably passed now, but I still have, I have colleagues at the university there where I studied for a year who have disappeared and have yet to come to light. There's various different dimensions to the campaign. So there's a sort of at the intellectual political level, there's something more kind of resembling a Stalinist purge taking place. People who are, quite, they might even be party members themselves, all of a sudden being found to be insufficiently loyal and detained or given prison sentences. The wider re-education campaign, the camps and so on that you would have heard about, that's motivated more by this sort of de-radicalization paradigm. It's a notion that is embedded in the policing of Muslim communities worldwide now. This idea that you can sort of somehow identify people who might be on a pathway to radicalization because they've they've given up smoking or they're not drinking anymore, and you need to intervene and ensure that they don't go down that pathway by putting them in this re-education process. That's one dimension of this. There's the labour dimension. All of this stuff is documented, but only documented partially, right? So when people talk about how many people exactly have been put through this process, the fact is no one really can put a hard figure on that question. Given everything that I've seen, I'm pretty confident in saying, at the high point of the campaign, or if we sort of sum it up over the last 3 years or so, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the figure of 1 million was borne out ultimately when we do have the evidence. But it's not a figure that
When was the last time you were there?
I was there in 2017. So 2017 was just when the new policing measures were coming in, and I didn't know about the re-education program that was being rolled out, but there was a lot of other visible stuff you could see, and it was really noticeable change from when I'd been there previously. Probably 5 years earlier was the second last time. Whole new network of police stations at the local level on all major intersections. You had things like checkpoints, which I'd never seen before. Checkpoints in cities where you would, and there was clearly a certain amount of racial profiling going on. So Chinese down one side, Uyghurs and other, Muslim-looking people down the other. I saw a military parade in the south one day that really had a sort of intimidating feel to it. The centre of the city of Kashgar just went into lockdown one day, and a column of troops and armoured vehicles went through and bellowing slogans. It was not a nice feeling, and but I didn't have a full picture actually of what was going on. I was travelling with a group of tourists, and they were asking me what's going on, and I tried to explain, but this was the point where the news was just starting to come out about what was really taking place.
What was the Chinese, the Chinese Communist Party's explanation or justification for what they're doing in Xinjiang?
The primary way they talk about this is as an extension of a counterterrorism campaign, which is why I made the point earlier about the way in which some of these principles come up in policing and sort of counterterrorism work elsewhere, because China has really since 9/11, since 2001, China has quite consciously adapted its rhetoric to this new framework of counterterrorism, going from counterterrorism through to this more recent, preemptive de-radicalization paradigm. Now, Western governments don't, intern large sections of their domestic Muslim population, but a lot of the same ideas are present in the way that we have been looking at Muslims as potential terrorists. So China's discourse on this is actually quite cosmopolitan. I mean, they just released another document a couple of days ago I was reading where they said, we're just doing what Britain does with its PREVENT program with France. France did actually have a de-radicalization center, a short-lived one. And China points to this stuff and says, look, we're just learning from what you've been doing, and in fact, we're doing it better. And I think, when I comment on this stuff, I call attention to this because I think it's going to actually be very difficult for anyone outside China to really make a dent on this rhetoric and the justifications for what they're doing if we're not at the same time showing that we have a critique of this paradigm more generally and the harm that it's doing to Muslim populations elsewhere.
And as I recall, I think Chinese policy, the CCP's policy early on had the support of the US and the Western allies.
Yeah. So there was a certain amount of horse trading after 9/11, and you saw this, for example, in the Philippines, places like that. In order to get counterterrorism collaboration with the US or support for America's interventions into Iraq and Afghanistan, governments around the world were able to kind of get US endorsement for their depiction of their domestic enemies as a terrorist threat. Right? And China was among these. So there was an organization that was, there's no denying that, there have been people cross the borders from Xinjiang going to places like Pakistan, or now, you'll find some Uyghurs in Syria who are, desperate enough to think that if they get some military training, they'll one day be able to go back to China. And none of this is really closely connected to any incidents inside China. But in any case, the US went along with this idea that there was this terrorist organization that existed inside and outside China, and that was what was really motivating Uyghur opposition to Chinese policies, and that they kept that on their terrorism list for, up until very recently, they took it off. But there's more recent things we could point to. I mentioned the British PREVENT program, which is it's one of these programs that got rolled out to schools and mosques, to supposedly, preemptively identify people who are at risk of radicalization. So as late as 2017, people who were involved in that were going to China, to Xinjiang itself, to talk about, best practice in, policing Muslims. So counterterrorism has been this field of exchange for China up until very recently. Australia, the Federal Police in Australia as well, was signing MOUs with China on counterterrorism up until around that time as well.
So the point is that things hasn't always been the case. It's always been that we are critical of Chinese policy, or the CCP's policy on this, but it has changed. And what has it, just drawing you back on our earlier point before, what has brought about this panic? And how do we, as not part of the business or security elite, how do we try to make sense of this? How do we kind of separate our concern for what's happening in Xinjiang with the larger picture of the rise of China?
Yeah, so the first thing I guess is to, as you just said, consciously try to construct a position that is independent from these two powerful influences, at the elite level on Australian foreign policy, the security wing and the corporate wing. Because, neither of those positions really offer an attractive pathway for the future. A Cold War with the potential of turning into a hot war, a decades-long confrontation with China. I don't think anyone, anyone here has an interest in that. At the same time, we know, and it's sort of come to light in the course of this, in the course of this shift, that the corporate engagement with China was not always the most morally defensible position. A lot of stuff was swept under the carpet. There's clearly a sort of revolving door at the elite level that has led to various forms of corruption and undue influence and so on. And so, to simply say that, well, the alternative to the warmongering right now is to just try to go back to the way things were, I don't think that's a defensible position. I think we can take, the fact that we are in this sort of situation of confrontation has led to heightened scrutiny of these kinds of goings on at the corporate level. It's led to heightened scrutiny of, issues in China's domestic politics that have often struggled to get a hearing in a place like Australia. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, that's something that we can build on. And I think people's instincts, when they come to this question, are probably the best place to begin. I mean, I think a lot of people can look at the brewing tensions between the US and China and think, we don't like the way this is going. At the same time, people think, we don't like what we see in terms of the direction of Chinese politics. And both of those things, I think, can be held together in a consistent politics. It's just that it requires us to start thinking, seriously about what it would be like to, put forward a principled politics of anti-racism, for example, that is, trying to kind of generalize these principles rather than simply sort of link a critique of human rights abuses in China to other China-related issues. I mean, I think that is, it's something that, in a sense, it's going to require some political transformation domestically as well, because it is a fact that foreign policy is just kind of off limits for most of us, and a lot of foreign policy questions are things that don't get much public exposure, let alone debate. So, I mean, I think part of what we need to do is open up the political process a little bit here in Australia so that those sorts of instincts that everyone, I think, has, that, we don't want to go to war with China, but we do want to extend support and solidarity to people in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, can actually be manifested in politics.
Well, Mark is looking at me.
Okay, sorry.
Just one last question though. Say if China were to invade Taiwan tomorrow, as the Economist predicted would, what do you think we should do?
Look, I don't think we should countenance any possibility of joining a war against China. I mean, I mean that has to be the starting point, and I don't think there's even much point thinking about what that kind of war would be like, because that kind of war will very easily risk going nuclear. And at that point, well, I mean, very hard to imagine any kind of, future for humanity. I mean, I don't want to sound alarmist, but I really do think that we're not in a position where we can afford a decades-long confrontation with China with the risk of a, spiraling confrontation into, to nuclear Armageddon in the future. Now, I don't think we're going to go to war with Taiwan tomorrow. I think that, but I do think it is important that we reflect on the where the logic of the position that the government has adopted might be heading, and the fact that the decision around whether or not to go to war with Taiwan is not one that would, that many of us would have a say in. It's out of the hands of Parliament at the moment. It would require simply a phone call from Joe Biden to Malcolm Turnbull. American facilities, on Australian soil would probably be activated. Scott Morrison. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be talking about now. I mean, there is a campaign out there for the War Powers Reform, Australian War Powers Reform. I'm actually not under any illusion that allowing a parliamentary vote would necessarily curb our proclivity to follow the US into war, but I think it would at least be a step in a democratic direction. So it's something to support.
Thank you. I think we might wrap it up. Thanks very much. Thank you, David. And thank you for listening to everyone.
What's the title of the guy's book again?
It's called China Panic.
Are they ready on sale?
Not yet. Maybe a couple of weeks.
I turned them off.